Okay, I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show Professor Colleen Graffy. I discovered her because I read an article that she wrote in the Wall Street Journal called "The Law That Makes U.S. Expats Toxic." Colleen is a former United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and she's a professor of law at Pepperdine University. Colleen, a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much.
So I've been talking to people a lot about the problems of the law that you're referring to that does make it very difficult for U.S. expats. So can you give us a little background?
Yes, I actually wrote an article about this way back in 2013 and also for the Wall Street Journal, and I called it How to Lose Friends, Citizens, and Influence. And it was because I was seeing so many American friends who were living in the UK where I was resident who were anxious about this new law that was coming into force called FATCA, or the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And the idea behind it was very good. We want to deal with money laundering, tax evasion, and particularly after 9/11, financing for terrorism. But the application of the act didn't take into account that there are over 8 million Americans living overseas, and they have overseas bank accounts, not because they're trying to do anything illegal, but because they live overseas and they need bank accounts. And previously, Americans that were living overseas really weren't under the full scrutiny of the U.S. tax authorities. And it's with the internet and communications, the World Wide Web, it has changed everything. So now many who were not being were completely unaware of laws, for example, like this one, suddenly found themselves caught in the net.
Okay, so there's this new law that comes along that forces banks outside the United States to tell the IRS or the U.S. government about the assets that American citizens, let's say like you and me, if we live outside the United States, that we might have in our bank account in London or in Jerusalem, for example. That's the big picture?
That's the big picture, and there's a threshold amount, so if it's a bank account with the equivalent at any one point in the year of over $10,000, and that's also cumulative, so if you have a small bank account here, there, and the other, then they are taken in the aggregate altogether. Now, this also includes any bank account to which you may be a signatory. So let's say you're an American and you're married to a Brit, and your British husband has a bank account, and you're a signatory, of course, that bank account is also considered. So it becomes very awkward in marriages where perhaps the husband does not want his or wife does not want their account reported to the U.S. tax authorities, thank you very much, because they're a British citizen and they fully report their taxes to the UK authorities. So now you have an infringement on privacy of individuals who are not U.S. citizens. In addition, if you're a resident in the UK and you're abiding by those tax laws, when you buy property, you pay what's called a stamp duty. So you're paying upfront for that property. But if you're also an American citizen, it means that you have to pay U.S. capital gains. So it comes as a big surprise to many, particularly those who are accidental Americans, that they, after selling their property, which they thought was going to be their retirement, are then having to pay a 40% capital gains to the U.S. government.
That's very interesting because a lot of times people say, wait a second, there's a tax treaty, so there's no double taxation. But what you're describing is an interesting phenomenon, which we do see sometimes in cross-border families, that it's a different name for the tax, and therefore you don't get a credit in one country or the other. Is that how it's really working out?
Yes, and I gave as an example Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is the mayor of London, potential future prime minister of Great Britain. And he was born in New York because his father was working with the UN in New York. And as Boris Johnson will say, he wanted to be near his mother at the time. So Boris Johnson, born in the United States, is therefore an American citizen. When he went to sell his home in Notting Hill, he was much surprised by the fact that Uncle Sam delivered a bill to invoice him for capital gains. In addition, which many people don't realize, is that the U.S. will also look at the exchange rate differential between the time you took out your mortgage and the time you sold. So I have friends who are selling. They took out their mortgage in pounds. They're paid in pounds. It has nothing to do with the United States. But when they sold, they were given the very alarming news from their tax advisor that they also have to write a check to the United States Treasury for the difference in the exchange rate when they took out their mortgage and when they sold, which sometimes can be tens of thousands of dollars.
I'll tell you, we see that a lot here in Israel because literally for decades, a lot of Americans have been moving to Israel and from the United States, and they have children, and those children are U.S. citizens, even though they've never even been to America. They don't speak English. And then when they get a little bit older and they get a job or they get some money that they've begun investing, they find out, wait a second, I have to file a U.S. tax return? We're talking with Colleen Graffy, who is a professor of law. She's also a former United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy. And Colleen caught my eye because of an article that she wrote recently, and she's been telling us about a previous article that she wrote about the troubles that new U.S. laws are causing for United States expatriates, of which, as she told us a moment ago, there are about 8 million of them. So one of the things I was thinking, Colleen, as you were describing the situation, is maybe this is just the way that the United States stops American citizens from mixed marriages. They say, no, you got to marry another American. That's what they're trying to do.
Well,
So
I call it the reversal of the Downton Abbey syndrome. Before, everyone wanted to marry an American heiress. They brought money to the family. And now people are actively telling their children, do not date an American. I forbid you from dating an American. The ramifications it has for the family, their estate, their property, their income, because, and the other is for Americans who are married to a foreigner, many are coming to the conclusion that they have to take their name off property, off bank accounts. Right. So you can imagine the position the U.S. government is putting Americans overseas in, that you are everyone's saying, now you better be pretty secure in your marriage before you do this, and it's not right to leave Americans this vulnerable.
Right. No, I think this is certainly, by the way, a big issue that I deal with in my day job, because as a cross-border financial advisor here in Israel, it's common that my American clients are married to Israelis. So not only the financial issue, but the emotional issue certainly, you're absolutely right, does create a lot of stress. Now, the name of the law was called FATCA, and many people joke, they say, well, really, that they named it that because it sounds like fat cat. And the idea was to stop all of these Americans who were hiding money offshore. And I just want to look at it from the side of the U.S. government. They say, listen, if you have your money in a U.S. brokerage account or a U.S. bank account, we know about it. We can see it and we can put a lien on it. At the very least, file an FBAR and let us know what assets you have outside the United States. Why would any congressman or citizen living in the United States have any sympathy for the 8 million people outside the U.S. who say, no, we're special now. We don't want to have to tell the U.S. government about our money?
Well, it's understandable that we don't want anyone evading their taxes or they're shirking the responsibility. And I think all of the 8 million Americans would agree with that. If the law is to pay your taxes, then you should pay your taxes. The problem with this is that the law is looking in the United States is based on citizenship. And that's kind of the rub of it all. No, there's no other country in the world except possibly Eritrea. It's a little bit different, but in general, there's no other country that taxes based on citizenship. They tax on residency. And if the United States did the same thing, it would take away all of these problems. So if you are a resident in the United States and you have a secret Swiss bank account, not that that's really possible anymore, but if you could give it a try, you will be found out. You should be declaring it. But if you are overseas and you have an overseas bank account, you have it because you're living there. And what's happening is that banks, because they don't want to fall foul of this law, because there's a 30% penalty of any investments in the United States, they're finding that rather than dealing with the tangle of U.S. laws and regulations, it's just easier to kick all Americans off their books, which means that Americans are finding it difficult to open up bank accounts. I've had the same thing happen to me. My bank is suddenly asking me, this is in the UK, they want a copy of my passport. Well, even if I give them a British passport, I'm a dual citizen, they see that I'm born in America, and then they say, if their rules are they don't want any Americans, then I have no bank account. I have to have a bank account in order to be able to operate overseas. So if we could change this law to residence-based tax, it would take away all the problems.
Yeah, certainly what you're describing, I've seen not only in terms of local banks, a lot of Americans who live in Israel go to their local bank and they can't, either they can't open an account or the bank says, I'm sorry, we'll let you have an account, but we can't do any investing for you in that account. But even worse is a lot of U.S. brokerage firms, they'll say to someone, oh, I'm sorry, listen, now you live in Jerusalem, you can no longer have a brokerage account with us. For me, in my day job as a cross-border advisor, this has been the area that I've helped people out in, but I see the amount of turmoil that it really does cause. I think I'd like, needless to say, as someone who lives outside the United States, I like your idea of having residence-based taxation, but I can't see that happening because why would America be willingly cut itself off from that revenue stream?
Well, in a way, they're taking away money that should be rightfully going to the countries where the American citizen is resident. So it's surprising to me that more countries don't protest at the fact that revenue that should be coming to them is going to the United States. There's another reason why the U.S. should care about this, which is these 8 million Americans are increasingly giving up their citizenship in astonishing numbers. And this is not good for the United States. And I look at this from my role with the U.S. State Department, where I worked under Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State. I went to 40 different plus countries. And what I saw was that Americans living overseas were critical to American foreign policy. Americans overseas are multilingual, they're multicultural, they are in tune with the culture, the commerce of the countries that they're living in, and they're critical to talking about American values, culture, foreign policy, but also in assisting with commerce. In fact, after that article, I received emails from all over the world, including from Israel, and a common theme was, I'm here helping U.S. investment in Israel. Why would my country make it so difficult for me to be an American citizen living overseas helping in this regard? It's not just those giving up their citizenship, it's also those that are now choosing not to become U.S. citizens, who don't want their children to be U.S. citizens. And this will have long-term policy implications for the United States. These individuals are goodwill ambassadors for the U.S. We need them, and it's short-term thinking to really make it very, very difficult for them to want to keep or want to become American citizens. It used to be a saying, one thing you can count on, no one ever gives up their American citizenship. And that's no longer the case, which is scary.
Right. And it is surprising. It's a very difficult conversation to have with people. But you're right, the numbers have been increasing by hundreds of percents over the past several years. Colleen, we are just about out of time. It's fascinating what you're saying, and you're giving a great perspective on it. But in the last few seconds, tell me, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, I'll probably be coming out with another article soon, and various articles on this theme. Probably best just through Twitter, Colleen_Graffy on Twitter.
Okay, so we will put a link to that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Colleen Graffy, thanks so much.
You are listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.